Hey folks, this is Craig from Asset Horizon. Today on Zer0 and Repeater Media, we are happy to have back Stuart Kendall to talk to us about Bataille, expenditure, waste, and climate change. I just wanted to take a quick moment to thank all of those folks who subscribe to the Asset Horizon Patreon to sign up for our Deleuze and Foucault reading groups. Also on Zer0 and Repeater's Patreon, we will have a reading group for William Gibson's Neuromancer coming soon. One more thing before we get started. Antioculus, A Philosophy of Escape, is available for pre-order just about anywhere online where you can pre-order books. By the time you see this episode, Antioculus, A Philosophy of Escape should be available on the Repeater Books website. So navigate to the show links below, check out the Patreon accounts, and enjoy our new publications. All right, let's get to the episode. Welcome back to Zer0 Books and Repeater Media. This is Craig from Asset Horizon, along with the rest of the crew, Will, Adam, and Noah. Today, we have the honor of speaking once again with a distinguished guest, Stuart Kendall, whom many, if not all of our listeners know as the notable translator of many of Georges Bataille's works, including Guilty, On Nietzsche, Inner Experience, and a few others, not to mention Stuart's own contribution of the biography of Bataille, which he wrote for the Critical Live series. We had Stuart on the show just over a year ago to discuss the influence of Nietzsche on Bataille and French communism, which is probably the episode that I've received the most one-on-one feedback about since starting the podcast. Today, Stuart returns to pick up a discussion on Bataille's concepts of expenditure, eroticism, sovereignty, general and restricted economy, and particularly as they relate to the ongoing global climate crisis. We want to know how this work can avail us amidst the catastrophe. In any event, Stuart, you are famous, appreciated, and well-liked by our guests, and it is very nice to see you again.
Well, thank you for that that generous, perhaps overstated, exaggerated, maybe even excessive introduction.
All right. Well, this is an episode about excess. So before we begin, could you offer your own introduction and perhaps mention some of your work that you're doing at the moment?
Well, I think you captured it in a nutshell. I've been thinking about writing about translating Georges Bataille and sort of his circle of folks related to him. I've translated books by Maurice Blanchot, Jean Baudrillard, Guy Debord, poetry by Éluard and René Char. A lot of sort of adjacencies to Bataille. I've written about Bataille in the visual arts. I did an anthology of his writings on cave painting, for example. His epistemology and theory of experience in an edited volume called The Unfinished System of Non-Knowledge. The core of my translation work has been his atheological Summa, as you mentioned, the Inner Experience, Guilty, on Nietzsche. But nevertheless, I've sort of moved across the work, through the work. And alongside that, I've written a series of articles on many topics, but 3 or so on general economy, expenditure, and waste. I've been doing that while teaching at a art and design school. So I've been doing that with the goal of informing makers and people who want to understand the world, but people who also want to change the world, who want to make the things, the tools and technologies, whether they're infrastructural or whatever it might be, that are going to help us navigate living now in the future. So it's on the one hand, it's for the library. I'm a creature of the archive. But on the other hand, it's for the street. So how do we take these ideas and do something with them? Is something that I'm very keen to, keep in mind at all times. So if I don't go off on, too many flights of theoretical fancy, it's for that reason.
Well, it sounds like you're doing good work nonetheless. So, well, with that said, I don't want to assume, I like to assume that every time we do an episode like this, we have new listeners and people coming to this work for the first time. Bataille has a rich corpus of concepts and conceptual terminology. For example, this distinction between a general versus a restricted economy. He has this notion of expenditure, this concept of eroticism and sovereignty. These are terms that might come up. We don't have to define all of these all at once, but as we come across them, it might be helpful to explicate them somewhat. But to get started, we have been thinking about Bataille's concept of expenditure for quite a while in our own reading group sessions. But today we wanted to home in on waste as a form of expenditure and how Bataille's concept of waste challenges certain paradigms of production operative in our world today. And you gave us a few essays to look at, including one called Making More of Waste, which perhaps we can share with others after the show. What does Bataille have to say about waste in his work, and how might it avail us in rethinking certain attitudes or norms around the production of excess?
Well, those are a lot of words. And one of the challenges to thinking about Bataille and really all these thinkers who might be related to his work is, something I might, on the one hand, think of as a kind of jargon factory, using terms in sort of technical ways that are forbidding to the non-initiate, to the exoteric reader. And so trying to fight our way into his terminology is, can be a challenge. Not least because some of these terms, he uses some of these terms in ways that we don't normally think of their use. So, sovereignty we put usually in a political context. He is thinking of it more typically in terms of just freedom. What does it mean? What is a free entity? Waste has other problems. If we're going to think about, what the word waste means, what is it to waste something? How are we wasting? Can we waste our waste? What is the place of waste in society? And this kind of a term for Bataille is ambivalent because we need to think about it and we can't get rid of it. Waste itself. We need to consider where it goes and what it means. It's something that we we're human beings. We produce wastes. We cannot deny this, and yet we do. A part of what it means to be a human being is to create a structure that organizes the production of waste, and that's what culture does. Culture allows us to control where and when we spend our energy, and spending and wasting for Bataille are very much synonyms. So thinking of a kind of continuum of terms here, and here that continuum includes words like consumption, expenditure, squandering, and waste. Bataille's going to use these terms very often interchangeably. Waste is expenditure. When we expend energy, we are wasting that energy. We're wasting it when we're not investing it in the future, when we're not thinking about what will happen with it later. Now that creates problems for us. If we're not thinking about what happens with our waste in the future, our future can be imperiled. And this has to do with sustainability, sustainable design. How do we think about the material resources and how we use them, how we consume them, how we expend them? Some other related terms, and I'll circle back into this, but some other related terms are, of course, gift and sacrifice or offering. Another one is squandering. And these are terms that Bataille takes on from a group of his influences, from Marcel Mauss and his notions of the potlatch, but Marcel Mauss also wrote about sacrifice. And then Nietzsche as well. Nietzsche's, the highest value for Nietzsche is the gift-giving, virtue, to be someone who will give. But that also can involve, he says, giving is sacrificing is squandering. So, how do we unpack all these things? How do we think about these trajectories? That's at the core of what Bataille is trying to do throughout pretty much his entire project, early to late. He's thinking about these kind of trajectories of expenditure, which is to say the peregrinations of, production, consumption, waste. Where do these things go? And to link that back into thinking about sustainability and sustainable design, there's a document called the Hanover Principles that's written by William McDonough and Michael Braungart. And we see this in their book, The Upcycle. And this is something that comes up in other places as well. But one of the core tenets of sustainable design is to, and they say, eliminate the concept of waste. What we need to do is think about, waste so that we're not wasting our waste. They very succinctly put it in Cradle to Cradle, one of their books. That modern civilization is a civilization that takes all of its most valuable goods and takes them to the dump, which is, of course, what we do. We dig up, rare earths, minerals. We put tremendous energy and technology into manufacturing something like an iPhone, only to have it become obsolete within a matter of months. And then we take those same materials and we throw them in the dump. We isolate them from ourselves. So how do we reformulate the circulation of material, energy, all these things? How do we reorganize all of that so that we're not wasting our waste, so that we can make more out of our waste? That's the core question for Bataille and I think for us when we're thinking about sustainable design. That was a pretty long statement though, so.
No, that's great. In fact, this takes me to a question that was lingering ever since the last time that we spoke with you. Noah had asked you a question in our previous episode regarding how we could make more resilient communities or practices. And your response suggested that we shouldn't be aiming for resilience per se, but rather considering the life cycle of our creations amidst a host of other concerns. And one of the phrases you used was that phrase, cradle to cradle, which I believe is an idea that encompasses all of these statements and ideas. Could you talk a little bit more about that? I know you included that in the essay, Making More of Waste. What does it mean, cradle to cradle, and how is this perhaps an instantiation of Bataille's ideas about waste?
So we're talking about a couple of different things here. I don't want to badmouth resilience. We need resilient systems, but we do need to think about a whole bunch of things, and that is part of Bataille's message too. Another thing that I think is very important when we're thinking about Bataille and these matters is that he's a paradoxical thinker. So Bataille is going to say almost always two things at once. And when we're reading Bataille, we tend to focus, I think a lot of people tend to focus maybe on one side of his work rather than another, whereas he brings things together. So Bataille talks, for example, about both taboos, so moral injunctions against things, and transgression. A lot of Bataille's readers are going to focus more on that transgression. They're going to say, we need to really transgress. We need excess. That's what matters most. And he says luxury is the big problem. So the excess does matter most, but we don't have excess without the taboos, without the moral regulation. We need both. And he says as well that when we think about, and this is an early essay on the use value of the Marquis de Sade, he says, in a post-revolutionary culture, because at that point he was still dreaming of a communist revolution. In a post-revolutionary culture, we're going to have to think both about the sort of rational organization of society. So how do we do things in the best possible way, as well as places for burning passion, for, the festival, for orgiastic fervor, all that kind of stuff. So Bataille wants us to both have, reason and that which exceeds reason. So we need to think about how that all ties into this production, consumption, regulation, waste, all those kinds of ideas. We need the regulation. We need the orderliness because we'll die without it. But on the other hand, humans are passionate creatures. We need that place for passion. We need to design passion into our social systems. We need to design ways to enjoy ourselves, into these social systems. We need to, in other words, also design places for waste. We need those places where we can let things go, and places for disgust. We need the sacred horror of waste, which is another topic that we need to sort of link to. But you asked about the cradle to cradle design philosophy. So again, it's a book by William McDonough and Michael Braunger, but it refers to a much wider array of design strategies, and they didn't even originate that term. It's a notion that has a much wider applicability, but it's a very clear one. And what it means is, you take a resource, you have it go through a cycle of production into a good that we can use, and then that good at the end of its life cycle, whether that is of short duration or long duration, can be recuperated into a new resource of some kind. So what that means is that you go from the first cradle, resource acquisition, to a new cradle. The moment of waste is the moment when we return to that second cradle. The flow of what they call nutrients, resources, goes through different phases. The life of an object goes through different phases, but it's never lost or interrupted utterly or broken. The example that they use to talk about breaking resource cycles is what they call monstrous hybrids. When we bring things together in such a way that they can no longer be taken apart or reused. And at that point, what can you do with them? Nothing. Take them to the dump. We take a lot of our resources, we turn them into monstrous hybrids, we take them to the dump. So we need to design social systems that regulate this process. And this stuff is already happening in many industries. In some countries, the production of automobiles has already taken on this quality capacity, so that an automobile producer has to think about the full life cycle of all the nutrients that go into that car. You make the car, you better be ready to get that car back, to take it apart and to make it into something else, to take those pieces and put it into something else. So that's the management of nutrient flows. And in the cradle to cradle world, we can think about natural resource flows and technical resource flows. So these are different types of resources. And when we cross the streams, sometimes we cross the streams chemically. We build a chemical and technical process that's going to ruin or spoil our natural resources. And of course, living in New Jersey, I'm very familiar with that as a problem. Nevertheless, this is a thing we need to regulate, we need to pay attention to, we need to think about. We don't want to cross our nutrient streams. We need to figure out where we're going with these flows. But again, what their goal is with cradle to cradle is the elimination of waste, for there to be uninterrupted flow. Now, Bataille is more attentive to the moments of transition between these states of things. And I think that's also important for us as, say, consumers, as users of goods, as shoppers. We need to ask questions like, where did this thing come from? Who's the farmer that grew this food? How did they grow this food? How did it come to us? What is the entire flow? Then what am I doing with it? How am I preparing it? Is this food packaged? Because packaging is a big problem with production of food. We produce more packaging than we do food for a lot of people. And we consume and waste that packaging. How can we eliminate that? And then what happens when we are engaged with the production of that food, like when we're cooking? How are we doing that? What cultural practices are we engaged with? What nutritional practices are we engaged with? And then what's going to happen after that? Composting programs, recycling programs. These are elements, offshoots of that kind of concern. What sort of a feast might be related to our, our consumption of calories. Bataille is going to have us think about all the elements of that. I'm just using food as one example, but the point here is to think about all of this, resource or extraction, engagement, production, consumption, as it filters through culture, institutions, and any number of economies. This also goes back to the terms that you laid out a few minutes ago, or some of them, the notion of a restricted economy versus a general economy. A restricted economy for Bataille is anything that we can isolate. So we can look at the production of a meal, for example, just to stick with that. And we can say, I acquired these ingredients from the grocery store. I made this meal and I ate it. But we have to widen the frame, according to Bataille. It's not just I went to the grocery store. It's who grew this? How did they grow it? What happened to that field? What was it that grew the grass that the cow ate when we made that burger? And then what's going to happen to the rest of that burger when we put it do we put it in the trash? Do we put it in the compost bin? Where does it go? To go from the restricted, restrained, the one way of seeing things in a very limited fashion to a much more general way of seeing the circulation of goods. And of course, those terms also have many other meanings for Bataille. They have disciplinary meanings. A restricted economy could be one discursive register, one disciplinary frame. Philosophers ask one type of question, or theologians ask one type of question. Sociologists have a particular focus, art historians. And Bataille is trying to work in a more general way, a way that moves beyond specialized concerns into thinking about the ways that human beings live in a more holistic manner. All of it. So it's not just, the production of knowledge, which might be the sphere of philosophers, according to Bataille, but rather the production of value, which might be the concern of theologians. So how do we bring all those things together? Restricted, general, the circulation of resources, natural, technical, through culture, through institutions, through disciplines, through human practices. And I'll also say, before I pause on this point, that what we're talking about here is, the three ecologies. Bataille is very interested in the environment. He's interested in human practices that engage with that environment. And he's also interested in social forms that give shape, that, rise out of those human practices, but also get tied back into the environment, the natural world. In the ancient world, and here I'm just following Bataille's examples, in the ancient world, we had agrarian rites, religious rites of sacrifice that tied us to the earth, tied us to seasons, that tied the human body to a physical place in a social group. But in the modern world, death of God, we don't have any of that. We don't have sacrificial practices that tie us to anything. We have modes of consumption, which are fun, but we don't have ways of tying ourselves to those ecologies into what, in ways that Gregory Bateson would call meta patterns, patterns that connect us. And that's what Bataille is getting at. That's what Bateson is getting at. That's what I'm trying to get towards, get at as well. But I've just said a whole lot of things. Does somebody want to?
No, it's fascinating, and I do definitely want to pass it to the other comrades. But I want to just point out something that I thought was very interesting and thought-provoking about your response, or series of responses, which is the importance of culture and sometimes what we think of in terms of economic determinism, right? As it being a kind of construct, not only that which establishes a mode of production as we might say, but also that which then filters production through modes of consumption and modes of waste. And not seeing culture merely as a topological effect of the economy, but something that's important. And we can save this question for later. Maybe you can say something about it now, but like, how do we then deal with cultural difference, across the globe, given that we have constructed this massive apparatus of global production and consumption. But we'll come back to that. I want others to speak first. We'll give it to Noah. Noah, do you have anything? Noah helped us set up this episode, so hop in, Noah.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to be here. I appreciate your comments so far. I think that something that's been on some of our minds is, as we finish the Accursed Share Volume 2, which in our emails I kind of alluded to, that we've been struggling with. You explained that it was an unfinished document, more of a series of notes than something meant to be published. But the idea of eroticism as a way of as a method that Bataille uses to kind of approach these sort of different, as Craig has put it, these manners of metabolism, of flows, right? And maybe you could just for a moment explain why eroticism is not just a buzzword, or why that might actually be a useful part of his corpus, because he does spend a good amount of time talking about it. And you've mentioned that there is a psychological and emotional effect of loss, of waste, that is kind of lost upon some of the design theory that we might have, or the ones that you confront. Yes. And so maybe this is how, this leads us to Deleuze and Guattari with, a libidinal economy, or passions and desires, right, or things along those lines, and how these worlds like intermingle, if you will. And that's why I think Bataille is very useful. But he often, as you said, to the exoteric reader, it's hard to maybe crack like what he's talking about when it comes to eroticism. So maybe just like a meditation on that would be helpful, and we can kind of go from there with various questions.
Yeah, eroticism is a tough one in this sort of circuit. So one thing to say about it is that Bataille approaches eroticism as a sort of privileged example. He says it's the best model for thinking about expenditure, and that's the way he characterizes it, particularly in Tears of Eros. He says we can either have the buildup of weapons of destruction. He's particularly concerned about war, but that also has to do with poverty, with famine. We can have the distinction between the rich and the poor get wider and wider, or we can find an outlet for expenditure that is, as he says, modeled on the instant consumption of eroticism. So eroticism is instant consumption. It's a model for thinking about expenditure. It's not the only type of expenditure. It's just a privileged model. People love it. People are familiar with it. It's a good example. So what does he mean by that? And, what are the other examples of expenditure? The list is not that long. And these are, again, sort of Bataille's privileged examples, but, and then we'll circle back to eroticism. His privileged examples are laughter. Laughter is a rupture in sense. We use words intentionally. We're very serious people. We develop knowledge, but all of a sudden we can be ridiculous, and we can disrupt that entire restricted economy of sense through laughter, through jokes, and our laughter can be utterly, convulsive, and that's a tremendous relief for us psychologically. It's a rupture of the spirit of seriousness, as he would say. So laughter is a mode of expenditure. One. He talks about poetry. Poetry is a similar disruption of the sense of language. When words all of a sudden mean two things, we have a sacrifice of meaning. We have a plethora of meaning. Words go off the rails. That's what he means by poetry. Poetry isn't mere communication in a very direct sense, the way that philosophy aspires to be, or often aspires to be. Poetry is the multiplicity, the proliferation, the prodigality of meaning. and it's a squandering of meaning in that sense. So poetry too is a mode of expenditure. Sacrifice, in the religious sense, is a mode of expenditure, which we talked about briefly. Sacrifice is a way of communing with with a group, creating a community by making offerings. And there's a lot more to say about this word sacrifice, which I'm not going to say right now. But sacrifice is a mode of expenditure, or it was in ancient and alternate civilizations. We have repressed sacrifice, and just as like we have repressed expenditure in general, we've repressed waste in contemporary culture. So we have these kinds of things. Now, eroticism is a privileged example for him. It's privileged because we can understand it, because it's thorough. He spends a lot of time talking about it. That's not to say that, Bataille and Wilhelm Reich are saying exactly the same thing. Now, Wilhelm Reich thought that eroticism was the actual solution, that the orgasm is the problem. And that's not what Bataille is saying. Bataille is saying that the orgasm is a way of thinking about or modeling the problem, this instant consumption. In desire and in eroticism for Bataille, we are no longer concerned with the future. Eroticism is not about reproduction. Eroticism is the immediate expression of desire. And that can be very problematic for individuals. Because in that desire, he says, in the book Eroticism from 1957, he says that eroticism is assenting to life up to the point of death, which is a sort of, well, we can link that to various thinkers, as I will in a second. But that's a very strange thing to say. It's saying that I will go along with this. I desire this. I'm going to let my desires lead me where they will. And that's not how we normally live. Normally, we live in a restrained way. If desire runs rampant, culture, we can't do anything. Basically, if we desire all of our coworkers, if we can't go to the doctor's office without experiencing desire, if there are no taboos, no locations for, no times for the unleashing or unfolding or the flowering of desire, then culture is haywire. And so Bataille understands all of that, and he's very attentive to all of that kind of stuff. And what he's saying there is again, it's a couple of things. It's that we are part of the life of the cosmos. This desire that we have to overspill ourselves, to let ourselves go. That's how energy is displaced in the cosmos, and we can live at the level of the cosmos or equal to the cosmos, a mesure of the cosmos. He would say. So we can do that in this moment of desire, but that can also be our death. So, that's not how we usually do it, right? Because we need to raise those children that are the result of that desire. Somebody's got to be around. And so we have more measured approaches. We say, this is okay at this time with this person. So marriage becomes the space in which desire can be expressed. We select the individual, and we become attentive to that relationship. We carefully curate the deployment of our desire so that we can be respectful. And this is where we see many of Bataille's influences coming together on this. This is again why it's a privileged example for him. He links this understanding of desire to the Marquis de Sade, for whom desire is everything. And for Bataille, the Marquis de Sade is a kind of anti-Hegel. For Hegel, knowledge is everything. For Bataille, desire is everything. And again, desire is this overflowing of energy. It's the exuberance of life. Now, is that what Sade really thought? not exactly. Bataille reads Sade and everyone else extremely selectively. After 1949, Bataille's reading of Sade shifts slightly because he's so overwhelmed by the way that Maurice Blanchot presented Sade in his book, L'Autrement and Sade, in that essay on Sade's reason. Before that, Bataille thinks about Sade very often, and I do think that Sade is a sort of secret key to thinking about Bataille's work. And we can see Sade sort of behind a lot of his other arguments. Nevertheless, it's a very selective reading of Sade, and I don't think we should confuse it with the real thoughts of the real Marquis de Sade. Nor should we consider Bataille's Sade to be the Sade of Sadism in the clinical sense of that. Bataille has no sense of these things whatsoever. He had read the Havelock Ellis and reviewed that in the 1930s. But he's not taken with this. This is not his concern. What he's concerned with is finding privileged examples that say what he wants to say. It's the paranoid critical method. I think this, and I find it in the world, therefore it is true. So this notion that he gets in Sade that desires the truth of the world, we see that in Freud, in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, the goal of life is death. We see that in Nietzsche, this notion of squandering being the highest virtue. So it's this overflowing that Bataille is concentrating on, and it's eroticism as that overflow that he thinks of as this kind of this privileged way of thinking about it. And Bataille also says, and my final point on this point, Bataille also says about Sade and about eroticism that no one takes Sade seriously. That we shouldn't take Sade seriously. We shouldn't admire the Marquis de Sade. We shouldn't admire what he proposes. Bataille is clear. Sade himself was in prison the whole time, and that means that he didn't have the wild orgies that he describes. He dreamed about those wild orgies because he was in prison. So while there may have been some, there were undoubtedly, and he went to prison because of them. There were some wild orgies, but the truly the mad flights, the utter flights, the dreams of the Marquis de Sade are things that he proposes that are utterly in excess of social reality, and yet that as an evidence of the sort of pure horror of dreams and desires. That's what matters to Bataille. It's an extreme case. So just as Hegel dreams of a purified, absolutely complete rationality, a pure reason, and a world of utter regulation, Sade dreams of a world of utter desire and incomplete. And Bataille knows that there's no purity. There's no absolute expenditure, and there's no absolute regulation. So there is only somewhere in the middle, and what we need to figure out is what that middle is, and how that middle is going to work for each of us as individuals and for communities. And that also means maintaining the difference of our interests. And that goes back to something we were talking about just a second ago. There's geographical difference, cultural difference, there's differences of age. Promoting difference is part of, is one of Bataille's interests. So non-logical difference is how he perceives the material world. And we are part of that. So we desire different things at different times for different reasons. And creating I'm going to call it immoralism, but it's ultimately a hyper-moralism, words that he's using, borrowing from Nietzsche, that is flexible enough to accommodate those differences of desire and regulating them in appropriate ways. That's what's at stake. That's what we're trying to do here. Does this make sense?
That's utterly fantastic. And I think that's probably the best description of eroticism that we have been working with. With that said, we'll go to Adam and then Will. Adam.
Yes, I mean, first and foremost, thank you for coming back on the show. It's great to talk to you today. Absolutely. I mean, I'm really loving the stuff you're talking about, particularly with cradle to cradle, in light of these Bataillean ideas of how do we, rather than eliminating waste in the traditional means of sustainability, how do we, in a way, waste better, not fail better, as Beckett said, but waste better. And I think this is such a important concept for kind of the main ways in which luxury is a problem in the face of the current climate crisis. Not in the sense of individualizing it. The idea of an individual's carbon footprint was a PR campaign for Shell, but even stuff which we all constantly engage in. I mean, for example, commercial air travel. Well, why do people fly commercial air travel? Well, partially for convenience, but why is it convenient? Why is it useful? It's useful because we only have so many vacation days off a year because we're constantly being called back to work at certain times. And so the luxury of a commercial air travel, which is a global, well, predominantly, more or less global phenomenon, is the problem. But it's a problem because we're not wasting better in a way. We can't take luxurious tours to get to our various holiday destinations. We can't even spend in the vicinities we're in because we always get confined within the border, the airport terminal. We have to get to the location we plan to get to because we need to get back to and from as quick as possible. So we can't waste our time. So we can actually properly go waste things in the place because we need to fix it there. Otherwise, we've wasted our vacation. We've wasted our waste. Now,
Exactly.
I had a question really about this, particularly in Bataille's work. It seems like there could be a bit of a transition in his work, or a tension between sort of the earlier ways Bataille thinks about how to waste better and the later ways. Because towards the end of The Accursed Share Volume 1, he's more systematic. He's absolutely sort of harking or sort of heralding the arrivals of people such as Gregory Bateson, the cyberneticists, even, I mean, the question I put, it was the designing sovereignty as a tribute to Stafford Beer's designing freedom. There's echoes of, cybersyn and stuff. But this question of, and of course, you in your own work, you bring in Buckminster Fuller, who literally treats the planet as a giant spaceship that we are piloting, and so he takes a cosmic view of the use and abuse of energy for life here. But do you think that in Bataille's later work, the overall systematization risks one of reducing the political element that you may get in, for example, his early essay, The Notion of Expenditure, where the real sort of mode of wasting better is first and foremost class struggle, and then sort of doing it in a very cyclical way, almost like how Desart's Libertine talks about waste in Philosophy in the Bedroom, where he says, because the Republic is founded on the murder of a king, it's founded upon crime, and therefore any properly Republican society must be constantly committing murderous crimes, constantly wasting in order to still remain what it is. And also the question of inner experience, because inner experience is a book that laughs in the face of project. It tries to do a project without project. And does that make Bataille, in a way, is there a tension within himself when it comes to doing these grand policy proposals or grand systemic mappings? I mean, it's not to say these are bad at all, but I'm just asking if there's a tension there, because at the end of the Accursed Share, he's no longer saying sort of class struggle. He's not necessarily saying revolution. He's saying, well, the Soviets have absolutely fucked this up. They're going to keep producing infinitely for production's sake until they collapse, which quite funnily they did, of course. And the Americans, we have to hope that the Americans will keep Marshall planning, using their surplus in this way. And then sadly, the military-industrial complex came in the steel chair and ruined that prediction. But yeah, I guess, is there a tension between the idea of designing systems of waste for Bataille and sort of the earlier politics of waste, or is there a sort of synthetic unity between the two in which non-knowledge, this other side of knowledge, this side of wasting sense, wasting experience, can that play a role in which we can actually design non-knowledge in a way? Is it designable?
Well, yeah. So you're raising a lot of questions here that I think are very, very important to think about as we're reading Bataille, as we sort of pull any book off the shelf and look for solutions inside of it. So on the one hand, I will say that like the basic theory, the primary point that he's trying to make, the division of the world between these two types of experience, the regulated and the unregulated, the taboo and the transgression, that is there in the, Use Value of Marquis de Sade, written, roughly 1930. And it's also there in eroticism, 1957, his sort of final statement. So the core of it remains consistent. Now, within that, though, Bataille is responsive to the events of history. He's a guy who wrote in dialogue. He wrote in dialogue with his influences. So he first reads Nietzsche under the tutelage of Lev Shestov. Then he studies psychoanalysis through psychoanalysis with Adrian Borel in the 1920s. He reads the Marquis de Sade in the context of, the surrealist moment, also in the 1920s, when Sade is just beginning to be published. And there's more to say about that. Like, Bataille starts writing about Sade before there is any Sade to read. So we need to remember that. But then, he turns against many of these things. He doesn't truly engage with Hegel until the 1930s, when he's more or less already framed out the way that he sees things. And that helps him to turn to anthropology, which he'd already done in the 1920s with his friend Alfred Metro. And he sort of plays each one of these disciplines and discourses off of one another as he looks for ways to frame his own thought. So that in 1938, for example, he can set Freud aside. He says, in this psychoanalytic study group on the topic of death that he set up alongside the College of Sociology, the introductory lecture to that, he says, Freud is great, but he doesn't have a lot to say about anthropology. So we need to study anthropology much more deeply. And that is to say, psychoanalysis takes a backseat. And Bataille doesn't mention Freud again in his writing. Some of the structures that are there because they're the base of his thought, but the references are no longer there. Similarly with anthropology, that Bataille has the adventure of thought that is the 1940s, including all of his responses to World War II, to the political climate of France in the post-war period, to the global political crisis that follows in that, and the drama with communism is part of those things. And then in that same exact moment, he gives the lecture in February of 1948 that he will rewrite as theory of religion. And afterwards, in the discussion after this lecture, Mircea Eliade, who had been in the audience, says, "You clearly haven't read any anthropology recently." So it's like Bataille is using all these anthropological models, but he hasn't been paying enough attention. And I think there's some chagrin there, because what does he do? He writes the book, but he doesn't publish it. Theory of Religion stays in the desk drawer, and Bataille turns to the deep study of history and to more contemporary anthropological texts. He reads Levi-Strauss. He starts writing about Lascaux, and he writes that first version of the eroticism book. At first, it's a book on Sade. He rewrites that in dialogue with Camus so that it, or reconceives it. Then he writes it as the history of eroticism in this kind of dialogue with anthropology. That's not working out. So it doesn't get finished. He doesn't finish that book, and he ends up rewriting it in 1956 for publication as eroticism in 1957. So you see him in each one of these moments pivoting. Now, again, the history of eroticism, written in the spring of 1951, and the text related to the book Sovereignty, which is also related to the Accursed Share project and has its own history, historical problems. Those writing projects are both profoundly derailed by the death of Joseph Stalin in 1953, in my interpretation. With the death of Stalin, you have a utterly transformed context of communism and thinking about politics, political economy, etc. So at that same moment, Bataille is also diagnosed with the condition that will eventually kill him. So he's got massive health problems. Stalin is dead. He's trying to figure out what direction to take. Do we go more philosophical? Do we go anthropological? Where is all this going? Now, for the Anglophone reader of Bataille, all these things are utterly absent, right? The texts of theory of religion and history of eroticism and sovereignty, these are presented as though they were effectively complete works, as though someone had gone into Bataille's trunk and said, "Oh, look, whole books, let's publish them." Similarly with the limits of utility, from 1940. When Bataille wrote each of these books, he was responding to very specific conditions. And those conditions are more or less obliterated by the publications. So they're sort of flattened. My cautionary word is to pay very close attention to the context. If Bataille is writing in praise of Marxist revolution in 1933, he's partly doing it because he's publishing that essay in La Critique Sociale. And they have, Boris Sovereign already said, "I don't know about this." He said, "I don't know about this strongly enough to put a header, a disclaimer on the essay when they published it." So Bataille throwing a little bit more of, let's be concerned about class struggle. But he didn't publish that essay again. That essay vanished. He rewrote the thing multiple times before it becomes the accursed share. And it's not just him deepening his thought, it's him writing for a new context. My final point on this, the accursed share, published in 1949, written and rewritten from ideas developed over 18, 20 years. We first see the residue of that in the late 1920s even. So Bataille was working on those ideas, and when he publishes The Accursed Share, it's a sliver. It's already a volume 1 of a project that he hoped would be multiple volumes. He thought that there would be another volume which went into more of the science of ecology, what we now call ecology. He thought he would write that book with Georges Bataille, who's a physicist. And so he thought there would be more of this biosphere stuff in there. There'd be more atomic physics, all those things which he knew that he could not write in a convincing manner. So he believed that there would be a second volume written along with Ambrosino, or maybe just published in the series that he was editing for Édition de Minuit at that time. But nevertheless, he knew that there was a wider constellation of thought. So some of the things are not present for political reasons, for change. Some of them are not present because he thought they would be elsewhere in his publications, but that never happened for various reasons. So there are the books that Bataille published under all these schemes, and then there are the ones that he failed to publish, that he chose not to publish. You also mentioned inner experience, which in some ways is his what do I want to say? It's his most disastrous book as a book that he published, because it's a complete mess. It's like a kitchen sink volume or kettle volume. It's got everything in there. It's got some poems. It's got some autobiography. It's got some theory stuff. It's got some wacky thought about Hinduism and resurrection. It's got an essay on Marcel Proust. He's got all that stuff in there. It's simultaneously, organized and intentionally disorganized, which I have said in other occasions. And I think it's very important when we're reading inner experience. He interrupts himself all the time. He's very concerned about whether or not the book is fulfilling a project. Is he going where he intended to go? So Bataille is very conscious in Inner Experience and in, if you look at the preface to The Accursed Chair, he's very conscious of the fact that he shouldn't be, and I'm going to say this, wasting his time like this. Using discursive terms to capture non-discursive experiences is against his philosophy. His philosophy should be a mess. It should be a balanced, explosive, it should be like a sort of contained supernova. And that's what he's trying to capture in the style of Inner Experience. But he knows that's a mess. So he dreams already in the 1940s of writing in a more coherent and convincing manner, because he knows it's important, right? And here we are talking about it. It's important. But how do we talk about it? How do we organize those thoughts? How do we present them? How's that?
No, I think it's very very important you bring up, because the preface to The Accursed Chair Volume 1 is so self-conscious. I think if he doesn't explicitly say it, this could all be a waste of time. And I think people sometimes, I've definitely done this as well, treat Bataille a little bit too much like he's someone along the likes of Alexandre Kojève, a man who, when you opened his drawers, you did find completed books. In a way, that was the most. We're still getting them published. It's kind of fascinating, but yeah. I mean, absolutely, especially in terms of how many journals, how many plans within plans, the quote Dune, fronts within fronts, the College of Sociology had. No, I think that's a really good way of responding to it.
Yeah.
So have we lost Craig? What? That's okay. What?
No, we haven't. I'm sorry.
Oh.
My fire alarm went off. This is such a hot discussion. Sorry about that. I'm sure at this point Will has something to say, and we definitely want to get him in. So go ahead, Will.
Yeah, so Bataille seems to have gone through like a remarkable series of transformations as a thinker. His shift on Sade, his shift on Kojève, his tortured relationship with Hegel, marked by his correspondence with Kojève. My question has to do with the relationship between his work on sovereignty and his conception of the sovereign subject in Inner Experience, because you made a fascinating point when you say that part of what makes Inner Experience a disaster of writing is precisely that it wants to evade the representatio discursiva that is the foundation of subjectivity, right? But what's so fascinating is it's the management of potentiality and act that is in there in the Kantian conception of the subject that will also forge the way in which we understand the sovereign. So there's this really strange tension where Bataille wants to give us this conception of sovereignty that is free from this notion of subjectivity that is actually our understanding of sovereignty, right? The thing that stands as the constituted possibility of the deliverance of the actualization of thought, right? So everything from what constitutes a person in Hegel to the way in which the B deduction in the Critique is formulated. So my question is, when we talk about all of the various transformations that Bataille had, where, like so many, he had this particular relationship to Sade for a while, this particular relationship to the surrealists, a somewhat laudatory relationship to a particular strain of existential thought. Is there a consistency, at least at the level of trying to free this conception of sovereignty from this bounded and properly sovereign in like the Hobbesian, almost monarchical sense of the subject, and trying to obliterate that as well? Because I almost feel like when we say that Inner Experience is a disastrous text, in a certain sense, like it's a disastrous text in the Blanchot nature of the writing of the disaster, right? Where like, this is really the only way you can communicate these things now after everything that we've done, after everything that's happened. It's almost like, so I'm wondering, like, is it, even though he has a strained relationship with all of his influences, is this one commitment to altering or destroying the conception of the sovereign subject that Western philosophy, or whatever you want to call it, has. Is that at least something that is somewhat consistent? And why, if it is, why?
Well, it is, yes, and it's perhaps the most difficult thing in thinking about Bataille and reading Bataille's work. What do we want to say? Do we want to call it obsession on his part? It's the thing he goes back to. He goes back to a fundamental experience that he had sometime, I think January 1927. We can look at that moment as the moment when he when the sort of the door is unlocked, and this he writes things like the solar anus after that. He becomes Bataille at a certain moment then, and he's looking for ways to formulate his thought after that point. The following fall, he's going to read Heraclitus and Nietzsche in Heraclitus at that moment. In short, he becomes Bataille through this kind of an experience, and it's an experience of a disruption of subjectivity, which is the main point that we need to think about. So what is the Bataillean subject? The Bataillean subject, or how is Bataille related to the subject? How does he think about the subject? Bataille wants to destroy the subject, as you're saying. He wants to destroy the relationship between the subject and the objective world. He doesn't want to destroy the subject by being the object, the way that Baudrillard wants to. He wants to eliminate both the subject and the object. So he doesn't want to be a scientist. He doesn't want there to be a reflective subjectivity. He wants to shatter the mirror. And he's not interested in a fusional subject, which is also, sometimes he says that he is. But when he says this word fusion, we have to think of it as meaning the eradication of both the I and the world, both the subject and the object, or both of us. There's no us in that. Everything goes back to this atheological construct that he will develop in the 1940s. There's no unifying element. There's only the production of difference. So Bataille's subject is a sacrificial subject, and what he is drawn to is sacrificing both the mechanism of knowledge, the mechanism of self-reflection, consciousness, right? He wants to sacrifice consciousness. And this is why he's interested in intoxication or, eroticism as a way to have desire overwhelm our consciousness. He wants to, eliminate knowledge. Did I say that already? He wants to sacrifice all of these things so that he can become one with the cosmos. To the extent that I am different from the world, that there is this I, then I am not fully participating in the life of the cosmos. I'm not living at the level of the cosmos. So for Bataille, the human being is a problem for nature. We're a problem for nature because we're destroying it, but we're a problem for nature because we think we're better than it, because we think we're separate from it, and we are not. We are in a certain way, yes, because we can step apart. We can do all these things to nature. But part of his project is to eliminate that separation and create what he calls intimacy, right? The religious relationship is not a relationship of knowledge, it's a relationship of intimacy. And it's not a fusion in the sense of that I become a greater we. There's no we in that, in the sense of a community of belonging. So this is why he attacks the notion of solidarity in eroticism. And that's, it's a brief moment when he's in his essay on Sade and the normal man. Solidarity is the feeling that we belong together. That's a community of ideas or faith or whatever it is. But Bataille doesn't want there to be solidarity in the sense of belongingness or any of those things. Nor does he want there to be sovereignty in the sense of an I overseeing either the we or the self. He wants to be a self that dies, a sacrificial self. And this is why he praises the notion of apathy in the Marquis de Sade. The way he reads apathy comes from Blanchot's reading of Sade. But what it is a way of being apathetic to the self. No longer thinking, I desire this, but being apathetic to one's own desires and becoming another type of desire, being overwhelmed by desire, so that it's not about I want. It's just about that flow of energy. He wants to become a purity of flow without any reflection in the Kantian sense of self-reflection, of imagination or thought. He wants to eradicate all of those kinds of things. And, to be the subject at a boiling point is the way he puts it in the preface to The Accursed Chair. So it's a very slippery thing. Jean-Luc Nancy thinks that this is a leap into irrationalism and sacrifice of, he faults Bataille for this kind of thing. And perhaps we should fault Bataille for this kind of thing. Perhaps it's untenable. Sartre claims that this model of subjectivity is untenable. And Bataille himself says that it is merely fleeting, these kinds of experiences, right? And that's another slippery issue. The moment of sacrifice is instantaneous, right? The moment of orgasm, the moment of release, it's instantaneous. We settle back into ourselves. We can't maintain ourselves at the physical level of performance demanded by that type of release. So we retreat. We become aware of ourselves again. All of a sudden, we are no longer engaged in that grappling, that intimacy with the world. We are back in ourselves. We're taking a breath. We're reflecting on just what happened. We're trying to find words to say what happened, even though those words will be inadequate, because words are always inadequate. They're always a selection. So it's a tricky business. It's a very tricky business.
I think though, I think the response to Nancy though by Blanchot on Nancy's criticism of Bataille, where the way in which Blanchot goes after the use of the human being and human immanence in Blanchot, where Blanchot ends up being like, no, that's the sickest totalitarianism. I think that in fact, Bataille causes a theoretical positioning or something that's posited theoretically by Nancy that Nancy probably never recovers from, in a sense. I think Nancy spends the rest of his life responding to Blanchot's allegation there in many ways.
The books are still coming out. The letters and books are still coming out. That's
fascinating.
Yeah, it's definitely true. I mean, I want to go back to this notion of atheology and just sort of remind us that that's the key to all of this. That's the sort of ultimate flower of what Bataille is thinking about. This recognition that there is of headlessness. There is no organizing principle. That there's only difference, and that we can only strive to differ from ourselves. And as we do that, we sacrifice our subjectivity. We let go of that thing that we were, and we become something different in a new context. And that's what he says a community is. A community is going to do that as well. That's what discourses need to do. They need to reorganize themselves. This is what institutions need to do. Industries need to do. We all need to recognize that there is no transcendent either subject or discourse or form, that modernism and history itself are, the problem. And we need to get out from under the functionalist paradigm, the utilitarian paradigm, the rationalist paradigm, all one thing, the Protestant paradigm for Bataille, and find ways to organize sacrificial subjectivity or the self-loss that we seek, because in another way, and this is just the part of the appeal of Bataille, he's right. we do seek those moments of self-sacrifice. We want to let go. Friday night, we want to do something different than we've been doing all week at work. We want to go and be in a crowd at the game. We want to go to a concert. We want to lose ourselves in something larger than ourselves. We want to go forest bathing. We want to sit in the forest and lose the sense of ourselves. We want to go to the beach and be one with the ocean, whether it's surfing or just floating in the sea. We want to go to the mountains. We want to be overwhelmed by something. We want to let ourselves go. And those are facts. But whether or not we recognize them, and here this is again a paradox in Bataille's thinking. Those are the facts. That's what people want to do. People have been vacationing by the seaside in Italy for millennia. And now we have to take airplanes to get there to do it, as we are saying. The vacation spots haven't changed. The vacation itself hasn't changed. The human beings are doing this thing. The thing that has changed is that we deny its value to us and its importance to us. And that's part of what Bataille is saying. It is not important. What is important is work. What is serious is our job. But what is a release, what is sacred, is something else. And so in the modern world, we've lost that sacred sense of release, or the relationship between release and the sacred. And this I call the fate of the sacred. We've lost that sense of the connection between release and the sacred in the modern world. And Bataille wants to recover that. He wants to find a new way to experience sacrificial subjectivity, the sacrifice of the self, that can be a grounding experience. And grounding is obviously false because there's nothing there, but loss. We need to find ways to organize it. Yeah, I'll go ahead. Somebody else.
And that's sort of one of the, because we recently talked about the limits of the useful or the limits of utility, and that shows also two very like Bataille is some of the strangest interlocutors of all of the, like where he posits a differentiation between a character in and I think it's Junger's Storm of Steel, but one of the Ernst Junger books, where the soldier experiences a sort of canonic laughter as he's blown apart, and he posits a difference between the self-sacrifice of the laughing German soldier in the First World War and of the monk. And given Bataille's Nietzscheanism, the ascetic monk is not going to be an entirely favorable figure for Bataille, but there seems to be a value judgment at the end of that chapter in The Limits of the Useful, where he does make a distinction between these ruptures. And I'm wondering, like, what are some ways in which we can make these distinctions for Bataille? Because they seem to be, like, precisely how one engages in this ethics of letting go seems to be something that's really important to him.
Yes. So the part you're talking about in the limits of utility, or the limits of the useful, however they translate it, he's reading Ernst Junger's book. It's called War as Inner Experience. So that's the title. That's Junger's title. Now, it's available in an English translation, so you could read Junger's book if you want. It's related to Storm of Steel, but it's obviously focused on, Storm of Steel is more straight autobiography. It's what Junger experienced in World War I. War as Inner Experience was written a couple of years after Storm of Steel, and it focuses on its exact title. Now, interestingly, that book was translated into French in 1934 under the title War, Our Mother. So war is conceived as this maternal figure. And that's at the same moment, Bataille reads that in the mid-1930s. It's the moment when he also writes those articles for Verve on the tragic mother, tragic earth. The earth is conceived of as a tragic mother. And this is like his Dionysian earth. And so you need to read that chapter alongside those articles, this way of thinking about nature as this mother and of that is a mother of tragedy and expenditure, a nightmare of expenditure. So the Junger book focuses on, self-loss in war, and Bataille focuses on that, and he draws it out. And Junger spends a lot of time thinking about, the animality of the soldier, like losing control and becoming an animal-like figure. And so there's lots of things to say about that. Now, Bataille also quotes from that book in Guilty. So when he's in the first section of Guilty, when he's saying no one experiences the war the way that I do, he's talking about that same book. And he's talking about those same experiences, taking on the war as a vehicle of meditation and the practice of self-loss, meditation as self-loss, the practice of joy before death. He's looking at the photo of the Lang Che and reading Junger at that moment. Now, what he publishes ultimately is Guilty. He doesn't publish The Limits of Utility. So we need to read those passages that you're talking about with sort of grain of salt, right? He rejects them, right? So it's a thing that we see in his published corpus. It matters. It's real. But it's not something that he stays with because it fails. As you're noting, it's not quite a convincing passage. There's some ambiguity to it. Now, the passage in Guilty that reflects what you're talking about, this link between the saint and the voluptuary, is the passage where he says that war has made us all live the lives of saints, right? And so he's reading at that moment also the lives of saints. He's reading Angelo Foligno, and later on he's going to read St. John of the Cross and those kinds of things. And so for him, the saints are the mystics. They're not the ascetic saints. They're the saints of self-loss and of sensual self-loss, the saints celebrated in Remy de Gourmand's Le Latin Mystique. So it's that history of Catholic indulgence in the flesh for mortification and self-loss that Bataille celebrates. And those are the saints' lives that he's experiencing. And that's the proximity to Junger in that. In any case, all of this is related to this notion of what a sacrificial subject might look like, and how do we organize society in such a way that we can have these experiences, without war. War in that example, right? And this is a privileged one for Bataille. You remember in the last issue of Asifal, he has the Heraclitean meditation. I myself am war. He's taking war on as a figure of meditation. And then he's reading Junger, War, Our Mother, and thinking about war as meditation. But do you publish that during World War II when your country's been overrun by Nazis? No, you do not publish that. And then after World War II, after the true effects of war have become clear, those things that you might have written in your notebook in 1940, when you're meditating on war and destruction as a mode of self-loss alongside the Lang Che, that's one thing. But you don't publish that in 1946, when we're looking at, economic devastation throughout Europe. We're thinking about the legacy of the atomic bomb. You don't publish that even in 1956, when the Cold War is at its peak, and when we have to think about, again, atomic Armageddon. So Bataille he's engaging with these things for the purpose of meditation, but he shies away from them. And ultimately, as I said, referencing that passage in Tears of Eros, his biggest fear is war. In the chapter in Limits of the Useful, where he's talking about Junger, his biggest fear is not war. He is celebrating war as a vehicle of self-loss. But by 1962 in Tears of Eros, throughout the 1950s, war is the disaster. War will be the kind of waste that we don't want. We want a different kind of waste. We want a different kind of celebration of excess. And if we think about that, like the ways that governments have built, stockpiled their arms, and this is something that Bataille talks about in Sovereignty. What have we been doing? What are people doing in the 1950s? They're taking money that they could be using on other things, and they're building nuclear weapons with it, and they're putting them in big holes in Nebraska. This is not the best way to use social excess. This is not the best way to celebrate a society. Not only is it a potential disaster, like for the planet, but we don't see it. It's invisible to us. We don't see the arms race. We can't celebrate the arms race. We can't see any of that stuff. So this question about making waste visible, making expenditure or consumption visible, making the government regulation or involvement with waste and consumption, making it visible the way that Aztec sacrifices are visible, that's part of what Bataille is thinking about. How can we see the waste in our communities? Like right now, the dump is far away. We don't go to the dump. We don't see where our things go. The dump is in Africa, or in China. It's the place where we send our refuse. We send our clothes we don't want anymore. We send our computers. We send all kinds of things that will play havoc with our soils and environment. We send that to places that, we don't have to go to, even on vacation. So how could we reintegrate waste and expenditure and the consequences of consumption into culture? If we want to regulate or rather even limit our consumption, one way to do it would be to stare at our waste a little bit more. When I'm thinking about this stuff, I often think about my grandfather who, lived on a farm, and he burned his trash every night in the 55-gallon drum, eventually died of cancer. So on the one hand, his waste was very visible to him. It was a bonfire every night, and that's a very palpable thing. That's probably not what we want. If all of us are burning our trash, it's a disaster for the planet. But on the other hand, there's a magic to that. There's something. How do we integrate both these kinds of things? Right now, we hide our waste, we obscure it, we hide our excess, from ourselves, from our partners, from our families, and we don't have a way of either making it visible or celebrating it or redirecting it in more productive, there will always be waste. We must consume. But how can we do so in the way that is both, responsible and also celebratory? How can there be regulation and the festival?
Yeah, this reminds me, I spent a few days at a Zen Buddhist retreat like 25 years ago. And my job at the retreat was to burn all of the garbage. And the injunction was, you don't leave the fire pit until you observe every ember of the flame burn out. And
Nice.
it was a very impressionable experience. And I think it echoes some of what we're talking about here. And actually, you somewhat answered one of the final questions that I wanted to ask you. One of what I perceive as the antinomies, I guess, of Bataille's thought is this idea that we've been talking about. And there's a quote in the paper that you gave us where you say that for humanity, expenditure is a distinctly human burden, right? It's because the fact of the general economy is always looming about the restricted economy. Things come into consciousness, right? We see or we perceive things as being, oh, this is productive for us. This is wasteful for us. And it seems that what Bataille wants us to do is expand the purview somewhat. And that's the question is, how does one rupture the purview of consciousness without realizing some radical form of subjectivity or desubjectification where we can perceive, for example, the animal realm or perceive the mineral realm in some sense. And here for me, there's echoes of this idea of a minor becoming in Deleuze's thought, becoming animal, becoming molecular, in that in order for us to be able to waste better, we need to be able to expand our consciousness or our perception to beyond the bounds of what we believe to be distinctly human. And so you've somewhat answered the question here, and like this whole idea of burning garbage and bringing it into focus and bringing that into the purview of consciousness seems to be perhaps one of the ways to do that. But I was wondering if there are other sort of practical interventions that people are experimenting with it that somewhat reflects that idea. Like, how is it then that we can have that consciousness that goes beyond the quote unquote rationality of humanity? Maybe there is a way that we can cultivate this rupture of the irrational such that we can bring it back into more, be somewhere better along the continuum between rationality and irrationality, in terms of what we waste, what we consume, and what we produce.
There's a lot there. It sounds like your Buddhist experience was a profound one. That would have been pretty amazing. So on the one hand, I'm going to shy away from offering the explicit proposal, because what we're doing here is dreaming to some extent.
Sure.
What we're doing is we're dreaming of the future in which there will be ways to celebrate the processes of consumption, to see the process of consumption. Whatever that. What does that mean? Does that mean that everyone's going to have a composting bin in their garden, or that we're going to see those cycles of rot and return? I think partly it does mean that. Like, those are some examples. Going to the beach with a different orientation, I think that too. And here I'm reminded of Aldo Leopold's land ethic, the Sand County Almanac, and his notion of a land ethic, an ethics that is large enough to include in its community the land. So that means the minerality and the animality and the flora and fauna in the largest sense. So how can we reconnect with those kinds of things? So rewilding, and bringing ourselves into contact with other entities, species, that kind of stuff. All of that is part of what we're talking about. Celebrating the entire range of materiality and energetics and life. Bataille wants to do all those things, and that's another thing that he's talking about with human beings and our unique capacity. Like I said, we're a problem for nature. We stand apart from nature, but that means that we can also intervene in nature, and we're seeing that right now, not only in the sort of genomic revolution, like we can design organisms that do all kinds of stuff. But, that also means that we can design our gardens, to take a sort of Zen approach, but also just a different one. Like, what if we all spent more time doing those kinds of things and living in a greater reciprocity with the material conditions of our existence? So a phrase that Bataille uses a few times is that human beings can create the most burdensome forms of life. So he's talking about burdensome forms in moments when he's also talking about luxury. And luxury is a burdensome form. Human beings create luxuries. We create things that are hyper-cathected with interest and value. Luxury is the problem, he says. And it's not that we need to eliminate luxury. It's that we need to have the right luxuries. So we need to have the right kinds of goods and the right relationships to those goods. If we have a bunch of, perfectly designed stuff that we don't care about, we have no problem putting that junk by the curb. Our IKEA furniture might be at the right price point, but it's a disaster for the environment. In terms of shipping it all over the world and not wanting to pass it down to our children. Now, on the other hand, if everything is a heritage piece of craft creation, then our world is overwhelmed with meaningfulness and we cannot move. So finding the right balance between durability and ephemerality is part of the regulation of the circulation of energy and matter. So some things should be ephemeral, some things should be durable. Finding the right burdensomeness, the right degree of luxury for our world will be the key to our future. If we cannot regulate those things, then we will continue to have a repressed and, I would say, neurotic avoidance of the problems of waste that we have had in the modern era. If we want things to just be merely functional, do its job and then I throw it away, that's the disaster of the modern economy. That's the modern commodity, and that's the modern landfill. To fix that problem, we need burdensome forms. As we need durable, but also burdensome and hyper-cathectic forms. We need things we care about and that we will attend to, that we might repair, and that we might pass on. As well as things we'll throw away for the sheer joy of it and smash.
Yeah, we just lost our IKEA sponsorship, but that's okay. Noah and Adam, I definitely want to get them in for one more question. You've been really gracious with your time. We're almost at the 90-minute point. You don't mind going like another 10 minutes or so? Is that okay?
No.
Yeah. So Noah, go for it, and then maybe Adam will finish up.
Yeah, I mean, we've been saying a word that's very important here, which is the future, right? The concept of the future. Like the tentative title of this episode is eroticizing the end times, or the eroticism of the end times. And you phrased eroticism, I think, very productively at the beginning, where you called it like an immediate expression of desire, and how that can be a double-edged sword at times. And so when we say the phrase eroticizing the end times, or the eroticism of the end times, I think there's two things going on that could be very useful for us to think about. One is understanding the flows of waste and expenditure that are problematic or useful, to use a heretical term, for our purposes now, or for our understanding why everything is going the way it is. And I think that the other prong of this is that there is this discussion of the future of the political theological concept of the future, of the eschatology, of when does justice happen, right? Of when do we demand, and perhaps this is where eroticism could become a politic, of demanding this desire now, of if we are to be erotically political, we demand this now. We demand justice now. It's just something that you've kind of provoked in my thought. And I'm wondering, I'm reading theology, reading these political theological thinkers about when justice happens, or about options to waste, options that we've lost, options in the future that are closed off to us, things like this, and thinking of finance and these other various institutions, right, of optionality there, and I'm wondering, and Bataille is so useful for me because of everything we just talked about, but is there a political theological line that you might draw out of Bataille with the demands that we kind of are making with him of how we would want to organize society in the future? Is there anything there? Is there an eschatology to be drawn out? If any of this makes any sense, right? I don't know. This is just what I've been thinking about. Yeah.
No, it's all very important. You're throwing a lot of words around there, so it's hard to sort of to grab all of them and tie them into a nice neat bundle. I'll take a few. And so, on the one hand, what I've been talking about is the meeting between the political and the theological. Bataille is concerned with, again, in my phrase, the fate of the sacred. The sacred has been lost, our relationship to it. It's been obliterated. I mean, we still have religion, but that's to a certain extent an avoidance of the problem rather than an embrace of the problem. And I mean the problem of consumption and the problem of sacrifice in contemporary culture. And how do we code that stuff? Building another megachurch is not the cathedral of our times. That's not going to be the solution to the political problems or the social or environmental problems. Some of the messaging in some of those churches might be helpful to us, but it doesn't go into the core of the personal practice that Bataille is talking about. So I'm gonna, I don't want to be utterly negative, because there are churches that are thinking about the care of creation, and that gets to the same goals with different ideologies than what Bataille is talking about. So Bataille wants to have there be a way of engaging with sacrificial offerings, a way of creating sacred relationships and intimacy with community and the earth, And that's really that's the core of his project. But what that does mean is, it's an intimacy, but it's also an instant. So it's a non-teleological relationship, non-eschatological relationship. Derrida talks about this a little bit in his essay on Bataille and restricted and general economy in Writing Indifference. The non-knowledge goes against history, which is to say the production of history, the thinking about the end times. The time is now in Bataille. And that raises a bunch of different questions. Now, on the one hand, we can live for the future. That's the political goal. That's the organization of society. And, as we were saying, that's part of what Bataille's talking about. But value and care, intimacy, and immediacy go hand in hand. They are not about the future. They're about the now. They're about finding ways to live now. And that can be immediate relations. That can be personal practices. That can be a lot of different things. That's not to say we need to have messianic outcomes immediately, but rather that we need to find personal practices that allow us to dwell in the now, which we don't, right? We have technologies that take us from now. We have technologies that, like we're using at this very moment, that record us and broadcast us, and that are not about me in this room. It's about all of us having this conversation that's distributed across time and space and recorded as long as the internet continues to function. So we have the power to stare at our iPhones all day and have our attention spans chopped up into 30-second bits. But to bring ourselves into a consciousness of now that is instantaneous and different. That's what Bataille is talking about. So it's atheological, it's aneschatological. It's a disruption of the process of history and of thinking about history. Kojève was talking about the end of history, and he was talking about the final knowledge, politics coming to an end, all those kind of things, and says, well, Bataille says, what about the useless? And he was already saying that in December of 1937. We need to find a way to live that uselessness. And that includes, these political problems, political utilities. We need to be in the now, according to Bataille.
Great. Adam, you'll get the last question or comment.
I mean, there's so much to sort of develop there, especially this idea of the uselessness, especially the rejection of Hegel, the rejection of Kojève's version of Hegel you get from Bataille. And I've always found Bataille a very useful analog when thinking about sort of resisting this total discursive system which consumes the imagination and essentially removes the presence of the future from the now, because it's all being systematized, it's all been rationalized. And I always find it very analogous with someone like Mark Fisher. The idea of capitalist realism, it's easier to to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, which is a quote from Jameson, but of course he very much popularized this turn of phrase. And particularly when it comes to the idea of the end times, or rather the current global boiling, as the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres puts it, for Bataille, it is this now. And in the sense that the question of luxury, it's one that's constantly going off into left debates about, growth versus degrowth. But I think one of the interesting things about Bataille is that it's growth for what purpose? We know that regardless of any kind of, every growth produces an excess, even back into his earlier writings about it in the notion of expenditure. Everybody poops. That, if you could put that as sort of the motto of Bataille, he might as well have written the book Everybody Poops at this point. So I guess it's just a sort of final rounding off question, just as we're sort of tapering things off here. The idea of planning and the idea of planning uselessness. How do we, because obviously when people hear about the idea of planned uselessness, and you mentioned this in some of your works, the idea of planned obsolescence. So I want to ask sort of the idea of, so how does planned obsolescence factor into an idea of a systematizing of or an embracing of the useless without making planned obsolescence, simply useful in the sense that it currently is, which is for constantly building more shit out of coltan, which has to be extracted under imperialist conditions in Central Africa.
Exactly.
But just generally, well, to move into some restricted questions to the general question, what's next for this project of Bataille and sustainability in your work? So, what are you currently working on in this project, and where do you think Bataille can take sustainability theory generally?
Those are a lot of things. So again, let's focus on some terminological issues. So sustainability, this term on the one hand is, we're familiar with this kind of a term, but it's not the first term that was used to address this kind of a problem. And it's not the only one in circulation now. So, in the 1960s, if you're reading countercultural documents, people talked about the steady state economy, right? So it's eliminate the concept of growth and go for a steady state economy. And this produces, it's related to documents like the limits to growth study and those kinds of things. But the steady state economy, is interesting there. Like, to conceive of something like that, that's not how Bataille sees the world, right? There is no steady state. The steady state is change. All that does not change is change itself, right? So what we have is metamorphosis. We need to think about matter and metamorphosis. How do things change, and how do we organize and understand and regulate that change? So it's not about steadiness. It's about, other than in the kind of rhythmic processes of growth and retreat that we have in annual cycles or those kinds of things. Like, how do we realign ourselves with that? But again, it's not about eliminating growth entirely or about achieving a steady state. Another phrase or term that's used to talk about sustainability is used by a guy named Tony Fry, who's a design theorist. And Tony Fry talks about the sustainment. So what we need is the sustainment. We need to enter into the sustainment. And there it's a kind of noun adjective problem, right? Sustainability refers to whether or not something is sustainable. And that doesn't sound like a temporal marker. The sustainment is a period that we could enter into. Similarly, this question about the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene is a term that people like to use, even though that too is not a very, kind of Bataillean term. Now, sustainment certainly isn't, because, it kind of gets there. But Bataille doesn't live in a world of nouns, He lives in a world of verbs, in which things happen. He lives in a world of fire, in Heraclitus' sense, a world of expenditure. So it's not about setting limits on the sustainment. That sounds like a science fiction movie to a certain extent. I mean, the goal is right, but the thing itself, the term, is not so helpful. Similarly, sustainability. We have some problems with that. And this goes back to what Noah was talking about, kind of, will we get there one day? Or are we there now? Or how do we live in relationship to these things? And so in some conversations about sustainability, there's this kind of offhand rejection of the notion because it seems utopian, right? Some people don't want to try because they think, in their apocalyptic sensibility, what's the point? I've got my apocalypse, you've got yours. We're each living in a horizon bounded by a different utopia, whether it's the Christian apocalypse or the progressive notion of sustainability. They're both utopian notions, and Bataille is trying to combat both utopias. He wants to get away from the messianic futurism, as well as the kind of the rational progressive utopianism that we get either politically or technologically in terms of sustainability. So digging into current practices, finding ways to live in the now, to orient ourselves towards practices that we can do today as individuals and socially, and reorienting our expectations towards that. As well as not necessarily, putting it on human beings the way that the Anthropocene argument does. The Anthropocene is productive because it's saying, hey, look at this. Human beings impact the world. But we've been impacting the world well before carbon became a problem, right? Everywhere human beings have gone throughout history, we have killed all the, mega fauna. And, we destroy our environments ubiquitously. And we've been doing so for millennia. So it didn't take an automobile to do that. Thinking about how we live is a problem that we've had for 10,000 years, not for 400 years. So thinking about these temporalities, I think is part of what we need to do. And by we, I mean like all of us, but I also mean I, because what I'm trying to do is have conversations like this, write essays like this, but then also find good examples and put it in terms that can migrate across disciplinary boundaries and discourses and contexts. To write in such a way and to speak in such a way that it can bring more people into the conversation, and therefore find some more solutions that will change lives. That's the goal.
Well, Stuart, I want to thank you for taking time on a Saturday away from your family, spending almost 2 hours with us in what is probably the longest episode we've ever done. Your work has been very valuable to us. It is not a waste, although you have given us some food for thought about how to waste better. And we look forward to talking to you again sometime or working with you in the future.
I do too. It's been a great fun. Thank you for having me on. It's been an honor and a pleasure.